A Christmas Miracle in Pajaro Bay by Barbara Cooley. Matt DiPietro stood on the steps of the old Pajaro Bay lighthouse, staring out into the darkness. It was a clear night, not a wisp of fog, as icy cold as it got on the central coast of California in late December. Matt put his hands into the pockets of his jacket. He had needed a break. They both had. He had been spending his Christmas Eve working on a report for the project, his former employers. He had promised to brief them on one of the Moreno cartel's obscure hideouts in the mountains. He had no idea why they needed the information, but it was no longer his problem. He would brief them and be done with it. He knew his wife hated these old ties to his past life, but he still felt an obligation to help, if he could. Lori was inside the lighthouse, working away in the little kitchen. Its cherry-red Aga stove radiated warmth as she finished batch after batch of Christmas cookies, gingerbread men and oatmeal scotchies, cinnamon twists and chocolate-dipped biscotti. The baking was going on feverishly, though it was almost 10 p.m. on this Christmas Eve. He knew what she was doing. She was avoiding thinking by working, baking, and fussing over the stove. She was keeping herself busy instead of dealing with what they both weren't ready to face. Neither of them had gone into the little bedroom down the hall. The door stayed closed to block the sight of the blue sailboat poster on the wall, and the little seashell mobile that Hector, the eccentric and addled old surfer, had insisted on giving them. The room was chock full of decorations. The teddy bear from Father Anselm, the storybook prints from his sister, and Hector's handmade mobile, hanging crookedly above the empty little crib. Matt knew he would eventually give away all the things they had gathered for the baby who would never come. But not tonight. Ricky heard the cry of the gulls over the roar of the big cigarette boat's motors. All around him the sea was blackness, except for the white of the foam kicked up in the wake of the powerful craft. The trail of white arced behind him. Nothing else was back there. So far. But he was sure he was being followed. He held tightly to the wheel. The array of display screens in front of him were lit up, the only lights he saw for miles around. He was driving through the deep water without running lights, going faster than he'd ever gone in his life. But it wasn't fast enough. He wondered how long he had. He had never driven a boat like this, but he had filled the gas tank before. That had been one of his jobs when he'd worked for the Moreno cartel, and he remembered how it had seemed like he was pumping oceans of gas into the huge tanks of the cigarette boats, much larger than the little panga boats he grew up with. These million-dollar speedboats were built to cross stretches of open water at an incredible pace. But that speed came at a cost. Fuel. He looked at the displays and tried to figure it out. Even at his best, he wasn't good with numbers. He didn't know how the kilometers on the navigation screen compared to the fuel gauge. Did he have enough gas to make it all the way to Pajaro Bay? He had to make it. He was going to pay back the shadow if it was the last thing he ever did. If he was going to die, he was going to make sure the score was evened up before he left this life. The timer went off and Lori put on the red oven mitt, stepped over the sleeping black German Shepherd dog, and opened the door of the cast-iron stove. The cookies smelled wonderful. She pulled them out and set them on the top of the Aga to cool. She was running out of places to put the cookies. The table was full, and the top of the stove wouldn't take one more baking pan. This would have to be the last batch. She needed to start boxing up the cookies so she could take them to the family dinner tomorrow. It struck her that she had baked at least one cookie for every person in Pajaro Bay. Even as large as Matt's family was, she might have slightly overdone it. She took off the mitt and pushed the blonde hair back from her forehead. But hey, since she was bringing them all these cookies, no one would mind that she was never going to bring them a grandchild, right? As if he knew, the dog got up and came to lean against her. She rubbed his big, bony head with one hand. Thanks, Shadowfax. You always can tell what's going on with me. Even now that she didn't have any more seizures, her seizure-alert dog was still tuned into her moods. No more seizures. After fighting all her life to deal with her epilepsy, she now had been seizure-free for over 6 months. After a year, she would be able to apply for a driver's license. Yippee. And all it took was giving up the dream of carrying a baby to term. Her last miscarriage had been her last, ever. Dr. Lil had broken the news gently, compassionately. No more trying. The drugs that were keeping her seizure-free also made it impossible for her to have a baby. And going off the medications was too dangerous. That was that. No seizures, but no baby. Lori sat down on the floor of the old kitchen and let Shadowfax lick the tears off her face. Ricky was drowsing over the steering wheel. "Can you hear the angel, Mateo?" he whispered. "It's calling me home." Mateo, the criminal mastermind known as the Shadow, couldn't hear. Mateo was somewhere across the vast, unforgiving sea. Ricky straightened up. He gripped the wheel tighter and tried to sit up straight, though it hurt somewhere deep in his side. His hand went down to the place where it hurt, and when he lifted his hand again, the palm was dark with blood. He put his hand on the center display screen in front of him. 23 kilometers to go. The angel was calling loudly now. "Not yet," he said firmly. "I'm not going yet." One more task to complete first. His hand stuck to the wheel. The blood was drying, and it made it easier for him to keep his grip now. The cry of the seagulls grew louder now, high and keening, like the angels warning him, "Hurry, hurry, there isn't much time left." He pushed the throttle all the way, and the boat jumped forward through the darkness. Lori was carefully packaging the cookies when Matt came back into the kitchen. There wasn't a single tear on her face. She'd made sure of that. She didn't want him to see how much it hurt. Then he would want to talk about it, and she wasn't ready. He went into the little sitting room next to the kitchen. He'd set up a card table there, and had it covered in papers for the report he was going to make to the project after the new year. "Do you have to do that now?" she asked him. Then regretted it. Because if he didn't work, they would talk, and she didn't want to talk now. "You want me to stop?" he asked. "I want you to be done with that life," she shouted, mad at everything and wanting something to yell at. He took it patiently, the way he always did. "I'm not part of it, not anymore. But it's important. George and I have to give a presentation after the holidays." Yeah, she said. "Secret agent stuff, and if you tell me about it, you'll have to kill me." "But George and I—" She threw the oven mitt down on the table. "I hate George," she said, which wasn't true. George Asher had been a true friend and partner to Matt, and he had helped Matt leave the project, helped him get back to a normal life. She should be grateful to him. But tonight, she hated George because he had a wife and 2 children, and he was at home with his family in Hawaii, and he was happy. She resented anyone being happy tonight. "I'm sorry," Matt said. Lori lifted her hand. "It's not you. I hate the whole world right now." "I know," he said quietly. "Me too." Then he got up and came over to her. "I can do the report some other time." She turned her back on him, not wanting him to hug her and make her cry again. "Go ahead and do it tonight. We have nothing more important going on." The crash broke the stillness only a short time later. The dog was on his feet and barking even as the crashing, from somewhere outside, continued to echo. Lori had dropped a tray of cookies on the floor at the first bang, and before the sound died away, Matt was already on his feet and reaching for the compartment behind the fireplace grate where he kept his gun. "What was it?" Lori asked. He shook his head. "Don't know. Stay here." "Not likely. I'll be there to call for help if you need it, but I will let you go first." At the storm door, she had to forcibly push the dog back to keep him from coming along. She shut the door on the whining dog and then stood on the steps and watched Matt cross the stretch of lawn toward the cliff, his figure illuminated by the sweep of light as the lighthouse beam ticked around in its metered circle. There was another beam of light coming up the side of the island cliff, from down where the dock was. Matt looked down the long steps toward the dock far below, then waved her forward. "It's an accident," he shouted. "Come on." They raced down the steps together. At the bottom, they found a huge, sleek-looking boat had rammed into the dock. In fact, had rammed into Matt's little speedboat, the Lorelei. Laurie's namesake had been torn from its mooring and pushed against the rocks. The Lorelei was a goner. The more powerful craft had split it in two, and it was already sinking farther underwater as each wave swept over it. Despite the destruction, the cigarette boat's engines were still revving. They saw a man sitting in the cockpit. "Turn it off," Matt shouted to him, but the man didn't respond. "Some drunken idiot out joyriding," he shouted to Laurie. "Merry Christmas." The boat's headlights were on, and one had been broken so the beam shone straight up, illuminating the side of the sandstone cliff. The big craft was jammed against what was left of their dock, its engines screaming in protest as they tried to go forward. "Stay back, Matt." Laurie grabbed him by the arm. "That dock's gonna go." "Not if I can help it." He shook her off and ran to the dock, then jumped the small gap to get aboard the cigarette. Laurie could see his body language suddenly change when he came up to the figure at the wheel. Matt reached around the man and turned off the engines. In the sudden silence, Laurie heard a high-pitched keening, like the cry of a gull. She ran out to the dock, which was listing crazily. Then she jumped the gap to get aboard the boat as well. Her sneakers skidded on the wet decking, but she kept her balance. The man at the steering wheel was not much more than a boy, maybe in his teens. A dark face, big brown eyes that were all pupil, labored breathing. "He's hurt, Matt." "Mateo," the boy whispered. Matt leaned over him. "Sí, Enrique." The boy said something in Spanish. Laurie caught the word milagros from the boy, then more soft words from Matt as he gently laid Ricky down on the deck. "What gift?" Matt asked him. "What do you owe me, and what do you need me to do?" He switched back to Spanish and asked more questions. Laurie didn't understand, but Ricky didn't respond. The boy closed his eyes and lay still. "We'll have to take his boat," Matt said to her. "Ours is wrecked." He pulled out his gun. "Let me check below, and then you can call for help while I drive." She watched him cautiously move to the cabin door, then freeze. He disappeared inside. Laurie held the boy's hand and tried to comfort him as he moaned softly, words like angelitos and milagros, and then in English, shadow. Shadow. Was this someone from Matt's past? From that time when he had been the Shadow, the notorious gang member feared by the entire cartel? "Laurie?" Matt called. "Come below." She patted the boy's hand and then went to the cabin. She went through the door. The cabin had been a luxurious concoction of shining chrome and soft white leather. Now there were streaks of blood on the silver and white. And on the girl. A teenage girl. Just a kid, really. With long black hair and a fiercely determined expression on her face, like a warrior facing a losing battle, but unwilling to admit defeat. The girl sat on the floor, her back to the smeared leather. Her eyes were closed and her breathing was labored, but she gripped a blanket to her chest, as if she held the whole world safe in her arms. Matt handed Laurie his phone. "Call Captain Ryan and Dr. Lil. It's an unsecured line, so don't give away too much." "I know the drill." Laurie got down on her knees with the girl. "Her name is Inez." Then he left the cabin. A loud, keening cry came from the blanket Inez clutched. The girl, eyes still closed, gripped it tighter. Laurie leaned over and reached between the girl's hands, pulling the blanket back to see. It was a baby, still wrinkled and wet from birth, and bloody. Laurie looked as closely as she could without disturbing them. and decided all the blood was the mother's, not the child's. There was a perfectly round little hole in the girl's chest that seeped blood with every breath she took. "Oh, Inés," Lori whispered. Inés appeared to feel no pain. There was only her mission, to protect the life in her arms. No other expression crossed her face. No fear, no pain, no worry. Just the fierceness of a mother tiger backed into a corner. There was a roar as the engine started up again, and Lori grabbed the phone. When she finished the calls, she knelt down in front of the girl again. Inés's breathing was shallow, fast. Her eyes opened, and her eyes focused on Lori, still unafraid, undefeated. "We're getting help," Lori said. "The shadow?" Inés whispered. Lori nodded, and the girl's shoulders relaxed. She closed her eyes again. For the first time, the weariness showed on her face. The baby started to slip from her grasp. Lori sat down on the decking facing her, and the two of them cradled the bundle between them. Inés opened her eyes and stared at her, but her eyes were beginning to lose focus, to blur into nothingness. Still, she clutched the blanket, refusing to give up. "Hold on," Lori said, again and again. To the mother, to the infant, to herself. Just hold on. Ricky lay on the decking in a haze of relief and pain. He could let go now. He'd done what needed to be done. His mind drifted back across the sea. He and Inés had hidden in Ensenada. They kept quiet. He worked on a fishing boat. She stayed home, out of sight, waiting for the baby that would be theirs, though its father could have been any one of the vicious men who had so misused his precious Inés. They had thought they were safe, but they must have been seen by someone who betrayed them for the reward. The word got back to the cartel. They would be made examples, to show what happened to those who tried to leave. The man who came for them was a boy he'd known for years growing up in the cartel. But it didn't matter. He took them to the big boat, blindly following his orders to return Ricky and Inés to their old village to be publicly executed. But the gunman had looked away at the wrong moment, and Ricky had grabbed him, wrestled for the gun. The bullets had ripped through them, but the man had gone overboard and Ricky had grabbed the steering wheel and headed the big boat out to the open sea. But where to go in the vast, unforgiving blackness, with death surely following his little family like a hound after a rabbit? Then he had thought of where to go. It had been another night, full of the same black sky and desperate hope as this one. "Run," Mateo had said to him that night all those months ago. He couldn't believe it. The evil shadow, feared by everyone, El Hombre's right-hand man, wasn't going to kill him when he caught him at the compound's gate where he had no right to be. "Run," Mateo had repeated. "Vámonos, now." Ricky grabbed Inés's small hand and pushed her through the gate. "I won't forget this," he had said to the shadow. "I will," Mateo had said. "It never happened. I never saw you." Now, Ricky pressed the buttons on the navigation display, searching for the name of the place he'd heard Mateo had gone. Pajaro Bay. Matt pushed the boat as fast as it would go, which was an outrageous 120 kph. He remembered these boats from his time in the Moreno cartel. He had told Lori his past as an undercover agent for the project was behind him, but it never really was. The things he'd seen, the lost lives and horror he'd witnessed, it was always with him. Enrique had been just another kid he'd seen along the way, just one more lost soul being slowly destroyed by the cartel. "You have a family, Mateo?" Ricky had asked him one time. Matt had looked down at the teenager who held an automatic rifle in shivering fingers. It was just another night, just another cold patrol back and forth on the gravel. Matt shook his head, but the boy had persisted in talking. "You ever think of it? Wife, kids, all that?" Matt nodded. Of course he thought of it. "Someday?" He shrugged. "If I ever get out of this life." "How many kids?" Ricky asked. I want to have 4. Matt smiled. 4? Why 4? The girl I like, she wants 4, so... Matt said. So there's a girl. Ricky nodded. And you? There are always girls, Matt said, lifting his shoulders in another shrug. But the girl? No. Then he stopped and looked out at the trees. I'd like to have kids, he said very softly. It would be nice to have a home and a family, a wife, little ones to raise. Yeah. Then he shook his head. But it won't happen, not in this life. He looked down at the rifle cradled in his arms. It's not for our kind, huh? Ricky said. Matt looked over at him. He'd forgotten Ricky was even there. No, he said. I guess not. Not for our kind. But you're not really one of us, kid. Ricky's eyes widened. He looked panicked. Not one of you? Of course I am. I'm loyal. Shh. Matt took a step closer. Not so loud. I didn't mean that you weren't loyal. But you don't have to live like this. You and your girl. You should go somewhere away from this. Ricky looked at him carefully, as if wondering if this was some test of his loyalty. I'm not trying to trick you, kid, he said. Just saying. You could do more than carry guns for El Hombre. You and your girl could do other things. You don't want her to be part of this life, do you? Matt looked down at the boy lying bleeding on the deck. His breathing was getting irregular, but Matt didn't dare let go of the wheel of this monster boat to check him. Hold on, kid, he said. We're almost there. Ricky remembered that voice, the one voice he could trust from his time in the cartel. There were other voices in his head, memories all jumbled now as he felt himself bleeding out, his mind wandering through the past. Ricky? El Hombre's smooth, sophisticated drawl had made him jump and spill the drinks he was mixing for the men. He looked up into El Hombre's face. Did you see anything on patrol last night? Ricky stood there, pinned by El Hombre's gaze, unable to speak. Of course he didn't, Mateo had said smoothly. If he had, he'd have told me right away. Nobody saw Inés. She must have been helped by one of her customers, probably over the border and long gone by now. El Hombre frowned. No one gets to walk away. Who cares, Sergio? Said Mateo. She's nothing. There are plenty more like her. Better ones. Now about the next shipment of meth ingredients through the tunnels. And the conversation was turned. Inés forgotten like a leaf that had dropped into a gutter and drifted away. Lori felt the boat begin to lose way, the expert shift that told her Matt was backing it into a berth. She heard shouts from the people waiting for them at the wharf. Then Matt was coming below, Sheriff's Captain Ryan Knight close behind him, a big, muscular Santa Claus in red velvet costume and jaunty hat. Deputy Joe was with him, in a dark suit that said that he must have come from the Christmas Eve service at the old mission church on the hill. Lori got up off the floor with Matt's help. She picked up the baby that Inés was no longer able to grip. She's badly hurt, Lori said. Captain Ryan lifted the young girl effortlessly and carried her out. Matt helped Lori keep her balance on the shifting deck as she got a good grip on the baby. At the clinic on Calle Principal, Dr. Lil was waiting, wearing something that must have won first prize at the Senior Center's Ugly Christmas Sweater contest. In the lobby, there were a dozen poinsettias, and the walls were covered with pictures of birds finger-painted by the local kindergartners. Dr. Lil started triage with an efficiency born of her years in Vietnam war aid stations. Kyle Madrigal came in the door, in a dark suit like Joe's. Heard there was a medical emergency? The doctor saw the baby in Lori's arms. Kyle, do an APGAR. Kyle took the baby gently from Lori. He ran through a series of quick checks on the baby's condition. It's a girl, a few hours old, I think. Looks like an 8. Is that good? Lori asked. That's very good, Kyle said. Help me here, Dr. Lil said. He handed the baby back to Lori. Check his vitals, the doctor said to Kyle. He started working on Ricky. Matt pulled out his phone. "Who are you calling?" Lori asked. "George." "What can George do all the way over in Hawaii?" "He knows people at the State Department." Lori pulled the baby close. "You are not sending this baby back to those murderers, Matt." "Lori, what did I tell you about George all those months ago?" She looked down at the fuzzy head of the baby and whispered, "Trust him with your life. I trust him with mine." "Yeah," Matt said, and stepped out the door to make the call. Without looking up from Ines, the doctor barked to Captain Ryan, "See what's keeping that chopper." He went to the front desk and Lori could hear him talking to the dispatcher over the radio. "About 15 minutes, he shouted. "She hasn't got 15 minutes, Dr. Lil said. "Joe, go out to the parking lot and make sure there's room for the chopper to land. If there's a car in the way, break the window and move it." When Matt came back in, he turned to Captain Ryan. "We've got to get the Coast Guard in on this ASAP. There's probably someone coming after them." "Do you need us, Doc?" the captain asked. "Go," she said. "Come with me," the captain said to Matt. "We'll be at the substation," he announced to the room, and they left. Lori watched as Dr. Lil stopped working on Ines. She stripped off her gloves and then donned a new pair as she moved over to Ricky. Lori backed out of the way. The baby in her arms fussed as if it knew, as if she knew that her mother was gone. Lori held her to her shoulder and patted her. The baby's skin felt cold. Skin-to-skin contact she remembered from her mother-to-be class. She went down the hall until she came to one of the treatment rooms. There was a gown there. Lori pulled off her sweater and wrapped it around the baby. She wrapped the hospital gown around her shoulders and then held the baby to her chest. Down the hall, she could hear the urgent voices, the beeps of equipment, the crackle of the radio at the front desk. But the exam room was quiet and dark. Now, after all the cold and blood, wind and confusion, she and the baby sat in the dark, warm little room that smelled of antiseptic. Soon the baby's breathing slowed to a steady, comfortable little snore. Lori didn't know how long they sat there in the darkness. She just held the baby to her and tried not to think. All of a sudden, Dr. Lil's voice cut through the quiet. "They're dead. You don't have to shoot them again." The voice that responded spoke Spanish. Dr. Lil apparently understood, because she said very loudly, "There isn't any baby. It must have died on the boat." Lori got Dr. Lil's message. Someone was out there, and the baby was his next target. She laid the baby on the exam table, pulled on her sweater, and then wrapped the baby in the hospital gown. "Air in el armario," the strange voice said, and she heard a door slam. Then she heard heavy footsteps in the hall. She peeked out the door and saw that the first exam room door was open, and there was rustling in there. She ran down the hall the other way and out the back door of the clinic. She heard the thud of boots working their way steadily down the hall behind her. The parking lot where Deputy Joe waited was on the other side of the building. Matt and Captain Ryan were way down at the Main Street Sheriff's substation even farther away. Kyle Madrigal and the doctor were, she hoped, just locked up in a closet and not dead. And she had nowhere to go. The man after them had traveled hundreds of miles across the ocean to make sure Ricky and Ines were dead. He wasn't going to stop now. How could she get around the building to where Deputy Joe waited? The back of the clinic faced inland, toward a little hill. At the top of the hill she could see the light from the old mission church's bell tower. She headed that way as fast as she could, which was not very fast when she found herself pushing her way through the overgrown escalonia bushes with a slippery infant in her arms. When she got past the last of the bushes, she saw she was in a cleared area about halfway up the hill. All over the hillside there were stones rearing up in the darkness, and she realized this must be the cemetery next to the mission church. She had never walked through it. The church's parking lot was on the opposite side. This side was silent and dark, as expected of a cemetery on a winter night. The paths were clear through the graveyard, though, gravel appearing neatly raked, pale ribbons against the dark of the grass on the graves themselves. Here in the lee of the hill, she could no longer see the lights from the mission church above. But the sound of singing came wafting down toward her, faintly carried by the cold wind. The church held people, and singing, and safety. She started to follow the sound through the paths, but then she heard a door slam somewhere behind her, and her heart seemed to jump into her throat. She took off like a shot, stumbling along in a panic until she tripped over a granite marker and fell. She twisted around so she fell on her back, the baby protected by her body as she hit the ground. The baby cried out, not hurt but only startled. The cry was piercing. She pulled the baby close and shushed her, but the baby's cry was followed by others overhead, and she realized a flock of seagulls was passing over, their calls echoing the baby's, and maybe, just maybe, confusing the man down the hill enough to cover their tracks. She scrambled to her feet, clutched the baby tighter to her chest, and ran to the mission. There was no light on this side of the old church. She found she was facing a blank wall built of thick adobe bricks. No opening, no lights to guide her. She felt along the wall, one hand clutching at the rough mud bricks, the other pulling the baby close against her, praying she didn't cry again. At the corner of the building there was a door. She felt for the iron latch, and it came open. She pushed at it. She heard the creak when the old redwood door gave way under her hands, so loud it seemed to carry on the air down the old path through the graveyard, down the little hill, past the quiet storefronts, and right down the main street of Calle Principal. Lori knew the man must have heard that creak, knew it in her bones. He wouldn't give up and go away. She knew the world her husband had come from, that world where old people and school children and teenage girls from the poorest villages were just chess pieces in a billion-dollar power game. Not even a baby was safe from them. The man would come. She slipped through the door and shut it gently behind her. The iron latch didn't have a lock. How did they lock it at night? Where was safety, if not in the old mission church? But she knew that safety was an illusion. People from that world of hate and darkness cared nothing for rules of polite society, cared nothing about innocent lives. That world had brushed against hers once, and she'd seen the destruction it left in its wake. She could hear the rousing singing loudly now, as the whole village seemed to be joining in a chorus of angels we have heard on high, in the main part of the church. But the room she stood in was still, a bit dusty, and quiet as a tomb. She cast around for a hiding place. The baby was quiet now, asleep in her arms, heavy and warm. Where to hide? There was a door opposite. She opened it. A closet, filled with choir robes and costumes from the nativity play, and priest's garb. She could hide behind the robes, but it would be the first place the man would look. No time. She set the baby on the floor very gently, then stood. She grabbed a cloak of rough linen, probably one intended for a poor shepherd in a play or something. She wrapped it around her, and then picked up the baby again, covering her body with the cloak. She slept on, unaware. It was no good. She knew this costume wouldn't fool the man. She had to find somewhere to go. She opened another door and heard the voices singing loudly. This door led down a little hall into the main church, and the lights ahead and the warmth of the song pulled her forward. She knew there was no safety in numbers, but still, to be around others, it was something. Lori came out of the hall and found she was in the sanctuary, directly behind the father leading the service. There was a large nativity scene set up here, with bisque figures, old and dusty and wearing elaborate robes. There were candles all around, tall creamy pillars all alight around the manger. The choir was still singing. She cast around for some place to hide, but all the people in the church were facing forward and looking directly her way. She raised one hand up and put a finger to her lips, then crept over to the midst of the nativity scene. Then her stomach turned over. She was sure she had heard the creak of the outside door over the sounds of singing. She knelt at the nativity scene and took the little doll out of the creche. Its bisque face was cracked with age, and the little swaddling was worn and mended. She set it aside and placed the baby in the creche, then bent over her and bowed her head, covering her own blonde hair and the baby's face with the cloak's hood. The people kept on singing, probably assuming this was part of the Christmas service. Then the door from the side hall burst open, and she heard it bang against the old church wall. The singing started to trail off as people gasped in shock. She couldn't see the man, but knew what they must be seeing. A killer, gun in hand, and murder in his heart. The voices one by one went quiet, except for one male voice, enthusiastically if erroneously singing, "Angels who have gotten high, sweetly sleeping on the plain." It was Hector, of course, the giver of the crooked little seashell mobile that hung over the empty crib at the lighthouse. From the corner of her eye, Laurie could see him smiling away, loopy as ever, happily singing at the top of his lungs, and oblivious to what everyone else was staring at. He finally stopped when someone nudged him. She saw his eyes widen as he looked at something behind her. "Dude! Not cool!" he said, outraged. But the same hand that had nudged him pulled his arm, and he sat down, muttering. Total silence. She could hear the hiss as the candles kept burning, their warm yellow glow so incongruous in what was now to be a house of death. She prayed that the baby wouldn't wake up. Even if they all were doomed, she prayed somehow for this innocent baby to be overlooked. Even as she tried to think of words for the prayer, she knew it was futile. Father Anselm spoke. They were words in Spanish, soothing phrases that did not seem to soothe. She heard a click from the gun, and he stopped talking. Heavy steps behind her. She could feel an itch between her shoulder blades as if the bullet was already there. She held her breath. The steps passed her, went down past the father to the main aisle of the church. She could see the man's feet now as she looked sideways under the edge of the cloak's hood. Booted feet, wet. Slow, purposeful movements as he went to each pew and stopped, seemed to examine all the faces there, then moved to the next. Left and right sides, slow, methodical, missing nothing. No one spoke. There was a tiny whimper from the manger. The feet turned on a dime and strode quickly up the aisle toward her. Laurie threw the hood back and picked up the baby. "No!" she shouted. She could hear the word echo to the rafters. But the man came closer. A boy, really. Probably not much older than Enrique had been. A boy so lost to the world that he would do this thing he'd been ordered to do without even questioning it. She stood up, the newborn in her arms. "You don't want to do this," she said firmly. But it was in English, and the look on the boy's face showed he either didn't understand, or if he did, the words didn't reach him in his single-minded focus on his mission. She stood there in the middle of the Christmas scene, surrounded by sputtering candles, her arms futilely cradling the baby. The gun was huge. One bullet would travel through her body, her arms, and the infant. It was hopeless. Her arms clenched around the baby. The baby fussed at the rough handling. One hand escaped from the cloak and reached up, toward the rafters. The gun wavered. The man stared at the baby. Laurie looked down and saw that a trick of the light made the candlelight appear to be held there, a golden glow cupped in that tiny palm. Silence in the church, so drawn out that she thought she would scream just to break the tension. Then the gun hit the floor with a clatter that echoed through the nave. The boy went down to his knees and put his palms over his face and cried. Father Anselm came over then and knelt beside him. The boy didn't resist when the father put an arm around him and spoke soft words again. This time, the boy just leaned against the father and cried. Hector stood up and came over, picked up the gun and took it back to his seat. He sat holding the gun in his lap, gingerly, like it might bite him. No one else moved until Captain Ryan and Deputy Joe and her own Mateo came through the big front doors of the church. Then the captain cuffed the boy, and the father went with him as they took him out. The boy looked back at the baby before he was led out the door, as if he wanted his last sight to be of that little hand holding the light. The day after Christmas, 4 p.m. It was raining. The rain seemed appropriate. Lori cradled the baby close to her, while Matt held an umbrella over the three of them. Father Anselm made it a short graveside service. The single shared grave was filled in by the sexton. Matt had said that a single anonymous grave would be less likely to be found by their enemies, and the father had agreed that Ness and Ricky deserved to spend eternity together, since it was denied to them in life. Dr. Lil was there, in black jeans and a black turtleneck that set off her snow-white hair. She didn't need to speak. Lori knew how hard she'd fought for those 2 young lives. Matt and Lori and the baby stood to one side and watched the dirt cover the final resting place of Ricky and Ness. Just Ricky and Ness. No one knew their last names. The father had helped them pick out a stone. When it arrived, it would simply read, "Beloved," no names, no date. They didn't dare say anything more. Who knew what danger might come to the village someday in the future, searching for answers? Lori cuddled the baby closer. What would happen to her now? Matt looked up, and Lori caught the quick smile flash across his face. "You're late," Matt whispered, as a man came up to stand next to them. Lori smiled too. George Asher had been closer to her husband than anyone, the one person he could trust in that world of darkness in which they'd spent their lives. Now they had both left that life, and the dark, handsome man standing next to them looked nothing like the flamboyant character he usually played when infiltrating criminal gangs. George stood silently beside them until the service was completed. It was over quickly. Dr. Lil left for the clinic. Father Anselm and the sexton headed back to the mission, and Matt, Lori, and George took the gravel path through the cemetery up to the church parking lot. "So this is the little one," George said, peering down at the sleeping baby. "She's heavy," Lori said. "I had no idea how tired your arms get holding a baby." George smiled. "But you wouldn't give it up for anything." Lori frowned, because of course she would be giving up this little person with no name soon. It didn't matter what Ricky and Ness had wanted for their baby. The child wasn't hers. She was in some strange legal limbo, born somewhere at sea between 2 countries, her parents dead, her life threatened. "We have to find her family, but we don't even know Ness's last name." "Suarez," George said flatly. Her last name was Suarez. They were at the car. The rain was still pouring down, but George just stood there in his expensive gray suit, with water droplets in his short-cropped black curls and rivulets running down his bronze face. He smiled gently at Lori. "Don't do that," Matt said. "Don't let Lori think this is going to have a happy ending. You know the law better than anyone, George. You said there was a grandfather. He gets custody." George touched the baby's cheek with one finger. "The grandfather sold Ness to the cartel when she was 15 years old." Lori cupped the infant's head in her hand. "Matt, we can't send her back. We can't." Matt looked at George. "If we fight it in court, the cartel will learn what happened. How could we possibly keep her safe?" He put his arm protectively around Lori and the baby. George reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. He took the umbrella from Matt and held it over them while Matt tore the envelope open and pulled out the papers inside. "But," Matt shook his head, "you can't just make a baby disappear?" "No, I can't do that." George grinned. "But the U.S. Marshals can." "But how?" George handed the umbrella back to Matt. "I told our old boss at the project that you didn't remember the layout of the tunnels in that compound. I would never withhold information like that." "Of course you wouldn't, but I would." He kissed Lori on the cheek. "Merry Christmas." He dashed to his rental car, got in, and was gone. Matt and Lori stood there in the rain. The baby slept on, oblivious. "What happened?" Lori finally asked when Matt said nothing. Matt held up the papers. It's a birth certificate, social security number. Everything a newborn needs to start her life in America. I don't understand. How is that even possible? Matt led her around to the passenger side of the sedan. He opened the back door, and she put the baby into the car seat Dr. Lil had lent them. The U.S. Marshals are in charge of the Witness Protection Program, he said while she buckled the baby into the seat. They gave her a new identity. But she's not a witness. According to these papers, she's a witness to the murder of Inés Suarez. Then he did something totally unexpected. He dropped the umbrella and knelt down on the pavement next to the open car door. He bent his head and cried. She's safe, he whispered, and she's ours. Lori fell to her knees next to him. She was getting soaked, but she didn't care. They both knelt there and looked at this tiny person. I saw things when I was under Lori, Matt said softly. I don't talk about it. I saw what happened to kids, to girls. Inés was a prostitute. The baby's father could have been one of hundreds of horrible men. And Ricky, he grew up in the gangs. They both knew what would happen if they were captured. When they were found by the cartel, we were their last hope to save their baby. They sacrificed their lives to get her to us, to give her a chance. And no one will know they were heroes, she said. We will, Matt said, and we'll make sure their daughter does. Oh, Matt, the papers are getting wet. She took them from him and laid them on the seat next to the baby. She saw the name on the birth certificate. Kai Milagra DiPietro, she whispered. Do you know what it means? Matt stood up and helped her to her feet. He opened the front door and helped her in. Lori was muddy and soaking wet, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but that the baby was safe, and she was theirs. He got in the driver's seat and started the engine. Let's see, he said. He wiped his eyes. Well, he said briskly, Milagra is Spanish for miracle, and George's sister-in-law is named Kai. It's Hawaiian. I think it means from the sea or something like that. He grinned. And you know where the DiPietro comes from? So Hawaiian, Spanish, and Italian. Quite a big name for such a little person, Matt said. Miracle from the sea, Lori whispered. She tilted the rearview mirror so she could see the baby, their little Kai. Sleeping away, her tiny hand clutching the strap of the car seat as it had cupped the golden candlelight in the mission church. Welcome home, Kai, she said. This has been A Christmas Miracle in Pajaro Bay. Copyright 2023 by Barbara Cooley. Hi, this is Barb. If you enjoyed my audiobook, you can support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. If you want to be first to find out when new audiobooks are released, click the notification bell. Also, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at barbaracooley.com so you can hear about all the new releases and subscriber exclusives. Thanks for listening. Have a lovely day.